Hello and welcome to Pastor's Perspective. I'm your host, Brian Perez. It is Friday, the last Friday of September, and we are here live in the studio until 4 o'clock on this overcast Friday. What is up with that? It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas or fall or whatever we're heading into. Give us a call with your questions about the Bible, the Christian faith, the weather. We'll answer them all. 888-564-6173 is our number. If you're watching on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, you see the number there on the bottom of your screen. You can call us, or you can scan that QR code. And that'll take you to the Pastor's Perspective page on kwave.com where you can submit your question online. But the best way to get an answer is to call in when we're here live. Because if you guys don't call in, why are we here? Right, Pastor Brian? We should just take the day off if nobody's going to call.
Well, yes. I mean, we want people to call.
Yes, we do.
That's why we are here.
Yes.
You know, I was just thinking, Brian, it was a week ago today that the Love Song film was launched on Amazon.
Yes.
And actually last Friday night, Cheryl and I, we watched all 3 episodes. And I had seen it before. Her and I, actually, we saw the very first episode when it was still pretty rough. They hadn't even finished it yet. We were invited, to a special showing. And then about a month and a half ago, I had the opportunity to watch everything. But then they did do some final touches, and all that to say it was, I think, really, really good. And I think if people want to get a good sense, we talk about the Jesus People movement, and of course with the history with Pastor Chuck and Calvary Chapel, and then more recently with the Jesus Revolution film. And where the Jesus Revolution film, of course, is a dramatization of those events and the life of Greg and Kathy Laurie. This is all just, live footage of the various times that Love Song would be on the road touring, or that they would be at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, and you just get a real feel for what was happening back then. So it's super cool, and I think it's timely too. I think with everything going on, and with it seems like there's a stirring in the culture. I've been little bit of a sidetrack. I've been doing some preparation because I'm teaching a course on church history, but I'm teaching the Great Awakening and the 18th century revival. So the course will be on revival, but I'm just kind of revisiting what happened in the first and second Great Awakening here in the United States, or wasn't even the United States during the First Awakening. It was still British colonies. And then the 18th century revival, which was Wesley and Whitefield in England. And then there was stuff going on the European continent and all of that. But anyway, just reading over that stuff again, it's like, wow. Man, amazing times. And, we've seen some of those, and maybe we'll see some again. So anyway, I think a band called Love Song is a good primer to remind us of what God can do and get us encouraged to, pray that he will do.
It is a good primer. And in fact, it's available on Prime Video. So check that out. That's and you can get more details at abandcalledlovesong.com. But yeah, you can check it out on Prime Video. Very good. All right, so we're supposed to have a special guest in the studio today, and while we await his arrival, I guess we can answer some questions that were sent in online. Yeah. No, wait, hold on. There was another announcement we needed to make. Well, first of all, the course that you're teaching, the history course, that's on Wednesday nights. Tell people about
starting October the 8th. So we have, 3 or 4 times a year we do what's called the Gathering, and these are a variety of different courses that you can sign up for. I think we have 10 or 12 different options, everything from, like Christian doctrine to formation to family parenting, finances, and I like church history, so I have been doing a series. I think this will be my 4th one on church history, and I've just I started actually in the 2nd to 3rd century, so I'm making my way on through history, and we are in the 17 and 1800s and looking at revival.
So I'm seeing 2 different history classes here. One's the one that you're teaching, and then there's one called Exploring Arts Throughout Church History.
Yes.
So what's the difference? Explain what that one's about. You're not teaching that one.
Well, that one, you know what? I have wanted to go to that one.
But you can't because you're teaching the other one.
Yeah, I'm either teaching or I'm out of town. Alan, who teaches that one, Alan is really, in some senses, a world-renowned artist, and he is also a theologian, and he is looking at art in connection with church history. And like I said, I've never been to it, but I have every confidence that it is a fantastic course. So one of these days, I'm going to get myself in there.
Very good. So yeah, like Brian said, there's about 10 or 12 different courses that you can sign up for. To get all the details, you can go to the Calvary Chapel Costa Mesa website, cccm.com/Wednesday. And that'll give you all the details.
Look at it. It's interesting. Bible Book Club, class on Proverbs, and then I'm doing the Great Awakening and Revival of the 18th and 19th centuries. And then Do Well in God's Economy. Ben is one of our board members who is also a CPA, so he does a great job with that. And then you mentioned Alan Berner's class, Exploring Arts Through Church History, Grounded in God's Love. That's going to be kind of a bit of a new believers course as far as I know from Jordan, and that sounds fantastic. Habits of a Healthy Marriage. That's a good class. Richard and Valerie Semino. They've got lots of years of marital experience. And then Mission and Culture, being bridge builders. Sean Havilar. Sean is one of our mission pastors. And then Praying 101. Wow. That's going to be a good one.
Honesty meeting holiness.
Yeah, because we need to pray.
Yes. We need to play honesty.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Honestly.
Yep.
Okay, that's it.
That is it. cccm.com/Wednesday to get all those details.
And one last thing that we can mention is Sunday night at 6:30 in the Fellowship Hall at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. I am resuming our Back to Basics Live through the Bible, and we are in Acts chapter 19. And Acts has been fantastic. I love the book of Acts, so we're just, kind of taking it a chapter at a time and just digging down deep into the history and then into the application for us today. So
very good. backtobasicsradio.com/live. That's how you can get details about that. Sunday nights at 6:30. All right, so let's answer a question that was sent in online. This one is from Edward, and it's a follow-up to what we were discussing on yesterday's program. He starts off right away by saying, there is no free will. Why, this passage says it's not the will of men. John 1, verses 12 and 13 states, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. So what would you say to Edward about that passage?
Well, that has nothing to do with free will. It's just expressing that the new birth is a birth that comes from God. It's not something that we, conjure up. It's not something that we can produce within ourselves. It is, as it says there, it is of God, born of God. So, and you're born of God by receiving Christ. So in that same passage there, verse, actually right there in the verse before it, it says, as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become the children of God. To those who believed in his name, who were born not of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, so forth. Receiving Jesus is, in the context, that is how one is born. Earlier, or not earlier, actually later, Jesus will say, in the third chapter, it's recorded for us, when he's speaking to Nicodemus, Jesus will say, you must be born again. And John is giving us a little bit of a primer to that in chapter 1. So has nothing to do with whether man has free will or not.
All right, Edward, thank you for sending in your question through the Pastor's Perspective page on kwave.com. Amber in Lake Elsinore also has a question about the Gospels. Well, not John, but Matthew chapter 15. Hey there, Amber. Thanks for calling in today. What's your question?
Hi. I was wondering, so Matthew chapter 15, basically starting in verse 4, but where it says in verse 5, he says,
well, I've got it here. I'll just read it. For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me as a gift of God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition.
Yeah, I was wondering what that tradition was. I didn't quite understand the context.
Okay. That's a good question, Amber. Yeah, so the tradition that Jesus is talking about is a tradition that developed kind of during the intertestamental period toward the end there. But it was a tradition that was an oral tradition that claimed to have been passed down from Moses as well. And the Pharisees in particular were the ones who they were sort of like the gatekeepers of that tradition. And what Jesus is pointing out to them is that your tradition is contradictory to what God said in his word. And Jesus would say this to them on a few occasions. You've nullified the word of God by your tradition. You teach for doctrine the commandments of men. And so it's this oral law that was popularized by the rabbinical leaders at the time that Jesus is referring to there.
Does this help you, Amber?
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks for calling in today here on Pastor's Perspective. And our very special guest has arrived.
Look who's here.
It was miraculous.
I mean, the last
Here
thing,
I am.
yeah, the last thing we heard, you were like 73 and something. So you must have got like teleported.
No, the internal portion of my wheel fell off, literally.
What?
So seriously, I may as well have been transported here by the Holy Spirit. So obviously, I'm supposed to be here now.
Well, what about your wheel? Where's your wheel?
It's being looked at as we speak.
This is Dr. Lou Wing, by the way, everybody. He's been on the program before, and he's got a new book coming out, and that's what we're going to discuss for the next several minutes, and might get to some more phone calls a little bit later on, too.
It's been quite a while since we've been in the studio together.
It has.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, a couple years at least.
Probably.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Okay, well, you've been busy since you were here last, and you wrote a book.
I did write a book.
Amongst other things.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. San Diego is a different planet.
It's a different planet, yes. You came here from planet San Diego.
The book is called Genes of Eden. And I love what it says at the beginning here on the Amazon page. What if our deepest struggles with sin and addiction are embedded in our very biology, and yet so is the hope for redemption? So what are you saying in this book, Lou Wing?
Yes, well, this was one of those opportunities. I've been in the drug development world for many, many years, and having sort of come to that resolution that I can no longer battle this issue any longer, I'm vice president, cell and gene therapies, and at the top of my game. And there was this gnawing sense in my soul of recognizing that gene therapies, gene editing, all of what we're doing to the genome essentially is a problem, not only biologically, but we're messing with something that I would consider divine, and that's the human genome, and one of which issues came about when we started realizing there was off-target toxicity with new genes that we'd like to introduce into the genome. And we can never figure out what that toxicity concept is. Like, are we turning other genes on? What are we actually doing? Where is this gene even put in within the 6.4 billion base pairs, right? So as time went on and I realized that there was some phenomenon that's either turning this gene off or regulating it, it all boiled down to this field of epigenetics. And epigenetics is the study of how genes are expressed. It's not the structure of the DNA, it's the actual function. And so it's like, DNA is the hardware and epigenetics is the software. So it's all about how certain molecules on top of DNA are altered to make a gene function the way it is. Well, that means that environment, whether it be internal or external, can have a major impact on how this gene functions. So I extrapolated that into theology, and I started to wonder, we're born in sin. As a matter of fact, Romans 5:12 tells us that we're actually culpable of the sin of Adam. And so one of the theologians that explored that the most was St. Augustine, who wrote several documents regarding original sin. It's a very controversial theology, and yet one of the major factors of it is that he, as a natural philosopher, he would never have considered himself a theologian, saw that this was an opportunity for him to explore it, and as he explored it in 350 to 400 AD, he saw that there was something somatic happening with genes, that with the sin in us. He could never explore genomics or genetics or anything like that. Didn't come until centuries later with Gregor Mendel. And so I looked at his work. I understood it pre-Enlightenment. This has nothing to do with evolution. It has nothing to do with any of the current science related to origins. It has everything to do with how these genes function. And so how is sin embedded in the genome? And further, how is the soul actually in us biologically? I mean, if we think about these ideas about biologically, how can we even dare ask that? But now that we have the tools, specifically epigenetics, we can actually explore this. And so my book explores the theology first of original sin, and then I look at epigenetics and look at sort of how we can have imprinted genes and imprinted gene function generationally. As a matter of fact, just like as studies have been ongoing about Holocaust survivors and how there's been generational sin, generational trauma within generations. And so they're able to trace dreams back 3 or 4 generations because there's been this imprinting of trauma. Well, this imprinted trauma can also reflect the imprinted soul. And there's aspects of our soul, specifically sin, that is in our genome, and it is propagated. And that means that instead of there being an ensoulment, like a created soul or God giving us a soul, this would infer that there is a traducian concept where the soul is transmitted by the father and the mother, and the two of them form this unique soul because it's tainted with sin. And we just know theologically that God, because he knows no sin, he is not involved with the soul at all. He is literally a part of the growth process and so on. But as far as the implementation, according to Romans 5:12, it's part of who we are in Adam. So looking at that and understanding how that would be displayed most prominently, especially looking at some of Augustine's writing, addictive behavior seems to be the greatest of correlates to showing and demonstrating that original sin is really part of who we are. In other words, we all have within us this moving away from God at birth. And there's an inherent understanding that this moving away process would be evidence that we have fallen. And even within the context of theology, there are many examples of we're born in sin. And this, as my mother conceived me. And so we have this, distorted soul and distorted behavior that is this ongoing process until this concept of redemption. And so redemptive qualities, and I sort of look at the cycle of addiction versus the cycle of redemption. I look at 2 Peter chapter 1 and looking at add to your faith virtue, and virtue knowledge, and knowledge self-control, and so on. All of those segments, those 8 different segments that produce love, is a cycle of redemption. It's one of the best anecdotes for getting out of the cycle of addiction. So all that to say is that's within this book. This book is a primer. It's one that I've done with a publisher called Whiff and Stock. It's a theology focused primarily publisher, and they believed me on the science, and they struggled with some of these concepts, and yet they finally came to the realization that epigenetics is actually a science that could absolutely explore this. And I've had some validation from theologians at Aberdeen University, at Fuller Seminary, and so on. And these individuals have provided endorsements and so on. So
epigenetics means like on top of genetics.
Yeah, that would be inferring that, yes.
Yeah, right.
And so it has nothing to do with the actual genes structure.
Right.
So like A, T, and G, and C are the molecules that make up DNA.
Oh, I knew that.
Right? And so it's like Jurassic Park, you saw that. And so what we see, the C of all those has a little place where a methyl group can attach. And a methyl group is where it would block any kind of outside molecules from turning or tuning the gene. So you can see how a gene can be silenced. What does that say? That says you have the same exact sequence of DNA in every single one of the cells of your body. Then how do you get a kidney cell? How do you get a liver cell or a neuron with the same sequence of DNA? It's an epigenetic phenomena where certain genes are silenced, meaning that an epigenetic phenomena, i.e. methylation, or there can be what are called non-coding RNAs, literally turn off a gene that silences it completely. So like every man is born with 2 X chromosomes, but one of the X's is silenced, which brings up a lot of interesting concepts about some of these problems we're having with the variations in this choice of sex and so on, because there is this challenge of epigenetics related to that. Also, with any kind of sexual deviations and any kind, there is an epigenetic phenomenon. Although the science may be complicated, that's one of the reasons why I put out this first book as a primer to give an overall picture of what this paradigm is. And once I have that settled, I'm moving to the next one that's going to bring in the book of Leviticus to understand how this is incorporated into a holy life.
Mm. Wow.
And so
I'm glad. I'm looking at that book, and I'm glad it's as I'm glad it's maybe like 120 pages, 150 pages. Yeah. That's
I wrote it for you, Brian.
Thank you. Yeah, I like all books.
You're actually in my acknowledgement, so I just,
Okay, so Lou, let's just back up just a tiny bit, because I think it would be great because there's probably like 1% of the people that are listening to us today that understood what you were saying.
Okay.
So I think it would be good just to go back a little bit and just tell us a little bit about yourself and how. I mean, you're talking some serious science stuff here. You're obviously talking theology as well. Mm-hmm. So kind of give our listeners a little bit of background. And again, you've been on the program before. Back in 2020, we were on a lot talking about COVID and all of that stuff. Sure. But it's been a while. So
certainly,
could you reintroduce yourself?
Absolutely. Yes. Lumen Wing. And I have been in the ministry for over 30 years. One of the fascinations to me is the understanding of science and the Bible. And so I have a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. I studied blood coagulation there, and that opened up the door for understanding blood in deeper ways, biologically and theologically. And so that sort of tied into this understanding and how we sort of positioned Leviticus within the Word of God. And then, after being in the biotechnology community for several years as a consultant, I'm a toxicologist by trade, and I studied cell and gene therapies and so on. One of the areas that it continued to really just eat my soul apart was to try to solve this issue in epigenetics, because it was such a biological issue in the drug development world, which it still is. And I wanted to know and understand how I could connect this most appropriately and with strengthening it with a theological paradigm. So I went back to my alma mater. I went to a phenomenal theology school, and I studied under Brian Brock, who was the moral theology professor there, and I worked alongside him. And as we developed this thesis, and it was originally called Theological Epigenetics, and I thought, that's a little bit tough for like you're saying, the 1%er, that turned more to 0.01%er. So, this is really looking at original sin in its place. And so after retirement, I finally was able to take this thesis that I had written for another graduate degree and bring it into a practical application in addiction and addictive discovery and so on. And so that's kind of where my trek has been.
Okay.
And so,
Yeah. And so, this is so fascinating because as you're talking about Augustine, and you're talking about, a 4th century philosopher theologian, and you're talking about that he was having insight into some of these things even then.
Exactly.
Yet, of course, the science hadn't yet arrived that would give him the genome and all of that. He didn't know any of that. Yeah. But he could see it through observation.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And he struggled it within himself.
Yeah.
So when you look at and study the Book of Confessions, you see all this coming out, City of God, and some of his writings to the Pelagians, and even his unfinished work to Julian is what I really use the most. And in one paragraph, he even says just that. He says, who could ever even explain in words this understanding of how sin is in us? And by even saying that, I take that literally. I said, here is an opportunity to actually answer that dilemma millennia later. And that's why this book, I believe, is so profound, because it brings about this connection pre-Enlightenment. It has nothing to do with how we got here from an origins perspective. It has everything to do with the human condition as it has been known. Since the time of Jesus, there was never an inference of any kind of phylogenetic origins or so on. It had everything to do with his person. I've had many discussions, many debates with colleagues of mine who just simply can't let go of their theistic evolution. Or people even pinned me as that. When I said, this has nothing to do with that concept. It has everything to do with how God designed our genome to be in fellowship with Him. They're tuned to Him. Literally. So there's a spiritual factor involved. So when we confess our sin, He's faithful and just to forgive. And that concept of forgiveness actually has an epigenetic the concept. There's one gene called the brain-derived neurotropic factor that's involved with neuroplasticity, like how we learn and so on. It's very dynamic. It's very malleable in terms of environment that we live in. And this particular gene can get stuck with concepts with unforgiveness. There's literally a scientific paper that's looked at religiosity, forgiveness, and the BDNF gene. And it's all an epigenetic phenomenon. So there is current science that's already addressing this. I'm bringing in the theology to do just that.
And so, I mean, it sounds like there's a little bit of that idea that you can actually alter your brain chemistry or whatever it is through behaviors or through thought processes.
Exactly, precisely. It's choices, and it's a willingness to really what happens when we're still and know that He's God. There's an epigenetic alteration that really, because there's a plasticity to it, it is able to be altered. And this is how we develop sanctification, how that actually is within our body.
Wow. Did you get that, Brian?
Yes, of course. I'm going to come up with my paper afterwards. No, so if you've got questions about this, give us a call at 888-564-6173. I think it's good to talk about the fact that, and we're coming up to our break, but like when it comes to addictions and things like that, and these are things, let's just take, drinking as an example. And people have been doing this for years, 30, 40 years. They have that come to Jesus experience. And some of their addictions go away, but there's the ones that just stick around, and they're just like wondering, what is it? So you're saying that the brain can be taught to not want those things anymore.
Your brain can be rewired, literally, following an epigenetic.
And I think, Lou, too, this will be great to talk about, the idea. I mean, I think most of us understand, like, addiction to a substance. But, of course, we've discovered that there's addictions to non-substances. There's,
Precisely.
Pornography is not.
There you go.
Precisely. Or gambling or something like that.
Exactly.
So
I can't wait to have it.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Or our phones or social media or, man, there's just so many things now that we can get addicted to.
Yeah, the phone is, you talk to my wife and she will tell you that she thinks I'm addicted. I don't. I think she's addicted to it.
All right, going to take a quick break, and then we will come back with our guest, Dr. Lou Wing. His new book is available on Amazon. It is called Genes of Eden. And Lou's full name, his first name is Lumen. You can find him Luman, Lumen Wing, on Amazon, and this book is titled Genes of Eden. We'll be back in just a little bit, 888-564-6173. All right, we're back on Pastor's Perspective, 888-564-6173. Brian Perez here, along with Pastor Brian Broderson from echoesofmercy.com. He also teaches on Sunday nights at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. 6:30 is the start time, and you hear him here on the radio, Back to Basics Radio, 3 times a day, Monday through Friday, here on K-Wave. And we've got a special guest in the studio. It's Dr. Lou Wing, who has written a new book called Genes of Eden. And genes as in Genes, not blue jeans, not denim. That's not what we're talking about here on the program today. Genes of Eden. And you can also, I mentioned you can get it on Amazon, but it's also available on Dr. Wing's website, which is lumenwing.org. And again, lumen is spelled Luman. So lumenwing.org. You can find out all about Dr. Wing there and purchase his book.
Okay, so coming back to some of the stuff that we were talking about a moment ago, Lou, you said something, and I want to see if I got what you were saying about the soul.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed like what you said, because this, of course, has been a massive mystery. What is the soul? Where does the soul come into the life? Does God? The body is created within the womb, and then is there a certain point where God, literally supernaturally touches and imparts the soul? So these are like theological and philosophical questions that have been asked for centuries. So it sounded like you were saying that through these ideas, you would come to maybe the conclusion that it's through the biological process that the soul is brought into being. Is that what you were saying?
Right, exactly. What I do is the soul is divided into 3 different theories. And one comes from Origen, one comes from Tertullian, these early theologians that were back in the 100 to 200 AD.
Yeah.
And these individuals...
And these guys were smart. They're smart guys.
Beyond, they had plenty of time to really...
They were like those 1%ers we were talking about.
They really were.
0.001%ers. And this individual... Okay, so Origen had the idea that the soul was created and it was placed inside of us by God, and it sort of ran around to that track. Then Aquinas comes along and says, no, that there is more to it than that. There is a materiality and an immateriality, meaning that there is some substance to it and there is some non-substance. So we call it a subsistence. And he said that God is involved.
So this Aquinas or
This Aquinas, okay. Yeah. And so Aquinas was similar to that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's right. And then you have this Tertullian, who was around the same time as Origen, and his idea was that there is a materiality. And he's the one that sort of set the whole standard for traducianism, and he called it that from the onset.
What does that mean?
The materiality of the soul.
Okay.
It's exclusive materiality.
Okay.
And so Norm Geisler holds to that, as well as some of the other leading current theologians today. And so because when we have the 23 chromosomes from the sperm, 23 from the egg, and they fuse together, and within that fusion, interestingly, the zygote is made an impermeable cell. At the moment that the acrosome, or the portion of the sperm enters in to the ovum, there is an enzymatic cascade that happens throughout the membrane so that no other cell or anything else can enter in. And that individual unit is where we start to see the emergence of the 2 sets of chromosomes forming that 48 or 46 chromosomes together, meaning that they're merging, and as these chromosomes match up, there's a lot of crossing over, meaning that certain traits from dad, certain ones from mom are all coming together, and all the 20,000 genes then become the unique individual. And it's within that space that all of the punctuation marks, and I say that because I don't want to say methylation without giving a qualification for that, but it's simply a lot of these methyl groups come onto the cytosines of the 4, they have A, T, G, and C. It's the C that has this open spot that allows this methyl group to attach. and in certain regions. And it's actually it goes from being called a genome, which is the structure, to now it's the methylome, meaning that's all of where these methyl groups are scattered in the different 20,000 genes that make them unique for the given cells that they will differentiate into. So you have the ovum has none of the punctuation marks. There are some imprinted punctuation marks from the sperm. So when the father, with some of the punctuation marks coming over to this clean egg that has none, there is this imprinted genes can often come across that will be unique from the father that will make this a certain gene silenced in the mom. And then, okay, so at that moment, the zygote forms, as I said, that there's 256 different cells that emerge from that one cell, and all those different cell types are what are epigenetically driven to make us this unique being that we have. The challenge can often happen, particularly in our generations these days, is that in this zygote process, moving into the individual cells and ultimately moving into the various tissues that we have, any adversity that occurs either by the mom in the babies in the womb all the way to 7 years old as a child, and because these punctuation marks are very movable at this point, certain genes can get affected, i.e. this is kind of where we're seeing a lot of the uprise, of autism. And if you're going to notice, one thing that's really interesting is the folate was brought up as one of the anecdotes. Folate is a methyl donator. That's what methyl is, or folates are. Folic acid, folate, is where we get the punctuation. That's why it's one of the prenatal vitamins, because it's what gives the access to a number of these punctuation marks so that the zygote has enough of them to punctuate a lot of the genes accurately. If you don't have enough, some genes can get altered or not turned on or tuned appropriately. The tuning process is how the proteins are made and generated to make up who we are and distinctions of who we are. So a lot of this carryover happens not only in utero, but all the way up to this early phase of life. Now, also, if the mom doesn't have much time with the child and it doesn't spend, there's can be often these attachment disorders. Well, there are certain genes that are affected, like oxytocin gene, for example, that will be altered, and the attachment disorders can result in other sort of maladies as mental disorders as a child grows. So attachment is so important. So these concepts is diet, exercise, all these kind of variables play a major role in how the genes are accurately punctuated for the health of the child. And it's interesting that some of these behavioral genes are the most malleable, meaning that, like I said, the brain-derived neurotropic factor has a number of ways that it could be altered epigenetically, and environment factors play a major role as well. So, I could go on, but you need to read the book, okay? But anyway,
well, you'll have to read it.
Are you followed some of that though?
You have to read it to me, and then
okay, I'll make a Kindle version of it. I know we have one. So,
yeah. Okay, so going back to the just the idea of epigenetics, something on top of the genes. Mm-hmm. So we are our genes, right? I mean, that's been kind of the theory.
Sure.
And so this is taking it kind of to a little bit of a different level. We are our genes, but we might be something in addition to our genes as well. Is that it? Like something that has impacted our genes that then results in the way we behave or whatever the case might be.
Okay. So in genetics, we have something called the genotype, and then we have the expression of those genes called the phenotype. That's been the classic genetics concept. Mm-hmm. But even within this phenotype, this expression of the genes, that process about how this gene goes from the DNA to the RNA, which ultimately produces a protein, those basics in biochemistry, biology, and so on, although it sounds confusing initially, those stages of those acts environments such as food, it could be anything, loud noises, situations, all of these factors play a major role in the production of how that protein actually comes out. And it's because, like you're saying, on top of the genes, it's the methyl groups. You have another chemistry that is involved with the chromosomes. And then, as I mentioned, this non-coding RNA, which is fascinating because, okay, there's another biological comment, is that your genome is made up of 6.4 billion base pairs. That's a lot, if you think about that. And right, 6.4 billion and only 20,000 genes on that. That means that the genes on this massive genome represents less than 1% of the entire genome. This was found out in the 1950s, at the same time that the genome was solved by Craig Venter and, this Francis Collins. They came together in 2000. They came up with the human genome. And they realized, oh my gosh, there's so much of the genome that is just repeat sequences. There's just these little regions that make no sense whatsoever because there's so many thousands of repeats. When in fact, they thought that was junk DNA. And they realized that, oh my gosh, that doesn't make sense. Why would it be junk? Why would God make junk on this? Why would he only put 20,000 genes and they're only that segment? Because all of that other DNA is facilitating the function of how these genes are expressed. And that's an epigenetic process. Because it isn't affecting the structure of those genes, it's helping them be expressed in that very unique way for your body, who you are, your family upbringing, the life you're living, the food you're eating, the people you're around. All the variables in my life are conducted by how our genes function this way.
So how does, practically speaking, what would you say, how does this knowledge help? How is this going to help? How is it applied? This is all, heavy science here.
It is, exactly.
And so, for the average person, how are you going to apply this? And, of course, in relation to the gospel, salvation.
Exactly.
So tell us that.
Right. And so we often think that we're just a spirit, and that's all we are. But when it says in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, it says, now may Jesus himself sanctify you completely, mind, body, soul, and spirit, right?
Soul, spirit, yeah.
And so that whole concept means that being sanctified means that it's doing something, yes, to my spirit, hungering for the Lord. It's doing something to my body and my mind by giving me a greater capacity to learn. What happens when I meditate on God's word? What is happening to me biologically when that actually is happening and I'm still and know that he's God? When it really means in Isaiah 26:3, when he will give you perfect peace when your mind is stayed on him. So these behavioral genes are very attuned to the spirit. And it affects the way I grow and understand who he is in my life. It facilitates my ability to hear his voice. And it gives me a greater sense of not only the Holy Spirit, but it gives me a greater sense of how to respond to conviction and not just develop this conviction addiction, which can often happen when we're so convicted that we don't do anything about it. It gives us a knowledge of the impetus to change because we see ourselves changing. If we recognize what our bodies are and what they're doing and being content with your body. That's one of the key factors here, because that discontentedness gives us this rationale that, oh my goodness, this is not the body I should be in. I should be in a different body because there's a reason why I'm not content. Well, this is where the spiritual warfare all comes in and how God's designed us to have that level of contentment, knowing how we take care of our bodies, literally. And it has a lot to do with our diet, it has a lot to do with exercise, it has a lot to do with the people we're around. Psalm 1 is very profound when it just starts off with, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly. That's the first step. Who doesn't sit with the sinners or stands with the sinners or sits with the scornful. That process is an ongoing situation in our lives all of the time. It's a constant process as we sort of move our way through understanding who Jesus is in our life. So it's transformational, literally. That's why I believe so strongly that, just like you say, it's a complicated science, and there's some of the theology is behind, is down there. But when we actually pull it up and look at what it is and what it's doing to us, the power of confession, the power of prayer, the power of being in the presence of God, being with other believers, growing and understanding the gospel in a different way, gives us a greater potential to experience who He really is.
So do you think, I'm thinking of it from the standpoint of, say, pastoral ministry, counseling, things like that.
Yeah.
So for me, if I kind of have this as a perspective, so I'm talking to somebody and they're, and we've both talked to people like this many times over the many years that we've been in ministry, people who just don't seem to be able to get over a hump. They kind of just keep, they seem to make some progress and then they just sort of slide back into the same old behaviors and things like that.
Yeah.
So if I have this perspective, it seems to me like it would give you more of a holistic approach to your ministry to that person.
Exactly.
So versus just saying, okay, that sin, let's, confess that sin, take your Bible home, read it more, pray more, and everything's going to be good.
God bless you. Yeah.
And we've done that.
Right.
And then we see, people struggling still. But if I come at it with this perspective, I realize, and I've done this times, where I'm talking to somebody and somebody might think that their problem is rooted in a particular thing, but you get an insight from the Lord, it's like, no, that's really not the problem.
Exactly.
The problem is actually over here.
That's right.
And do you see that as
discernment?
This helps you sort of have a broader picture of what might be behind the behavior, so you can attack it from a bit of a different angle?
Yeah, exactly. And so like that word of knowledge, for example, or the gifts of the Spirit in general, that sense of, yes, this is probably not going to be good for you or something along those lines. But the key being is that taking care of our bodies and our minds specifically is going to have a consequence. If I'm only going to be focused on my phone the whole time, or I'm only focused on these kind of things, the learning process, yes, we know that's we always kind of minimize that because that's just the way our culture is. When the fact of the matter is, it does affect our entirety. It is very holistic. What if I continue to eat this type of food all the time without thinking about what it's doing to me, for example, because, this is why I brought up the folates idea, is that, there is a reason why God designed our bodies to have a need for vitamin B12, for example, and ways in which I would integrate that into my diet, and or why blood flow is so important and why it's important to have my heart rate go up periodically, because it's going to help my lymphatic system. So all these kind of variables that happen within my body have a big influence on how I think and what I'm doing with my body in general. So,
and then what about something more? I mean, some of that, obviously, in our cultural context, we can control a lot of that. We can eat the right stuff, or we can get up and exercise.
Yeah.
Some people in the world don't have the nutritional resources, that are available to us. So let's talk about something a little more like that we might be doing to ourselves, like with phones and those kinds of things, because everybody's acknowledging now that there is a serious problem in our culture. Jonathan Haidt, wrote that book about the what did he call it? Not the age of anxiety, but it's, it just has to do with all of these young kids.
The anxious generation?
The anxious generation, who basically their whole lives have been taken over by social media and their phones, and they're all a wreck.
Right.
So there's some application there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is why we get to this concept of neuroplasticity and this idea what happens with learning, we call it synaptic strengthening. Like if you practice something and you practice it enough, you develop a greater connection with neurons and you start to become part of what we call a habit. And that habit, whether good or bad, is going to be something that's just the go-to. It's amazing how often we'll find a phone in our hand and we have no idea how it got there. And why am I even looking at this? Because we've trained it so well, it becomes literally like one of our organs. It is an organ transplant. And that concept, though, is really becomes something we've learned. And so the learning mechanism is all based on what an epigenetic phenomenon is, because it's geared around these molecules, like I said, the BDNF gene, that produces this protein that's very involved in how we get synapses to stick and grow new ones, new connections. So if we change from a phone to a watch and we started changing it only to a watch or some other vehicle to do it, our bodies would adapt to that because we have this addiction to something that is giving us the pleasure response. So we get into the dopamine serotonin discussion about this idea that, the gotta have it versus that I got it, and learning that concept of contentment. And how does that concept come, right? Because, one of the greatest ways of explaining the contentment is looking at some of these early studies that looked at dopamine and addiction, and studying these animals that were bred for cocaine. And they looked at this, they thought, well, this is the way we're going to show how we give the cocaine to them at a certain time of the day, and the rats would all come running up to it, and they always thought that it was the cocaine that made them addicted, when they realized that the dopamine spike happened just before the dopamine was given, because it was the anticipation that they were addicted to, not the cocaine itself. So there's something about God's implantation of anticipation, like the presence of God, like we are addicted to His presence. And the sin that can be so prevalent in our lives distorts that and takes down a different path. So we're anticipating something else instead of the true nature of who He is when we worship. So it's a distorted worship.
Yeah, amazing.
Let's see if we can take one phone call here before the program ends. Jack in Claremont, go ahead. We're running out of time, but what's your question for Dr. Lou Wing?
Hey, thank you for taking my call, and I appreciate everything. Great conversation. I'm hoping I can add to the conversation.
Okay.
Just more to the future in medical ethics was that what would prevent us from, the possibilities of, going in the right directions, but also going in the wrong directions, biblically saying, hey, the addictions we can get erased, but we can splice in something else that would mean something else, like, the mark of the beast type thing. Where's the medical ethics lie in this? And religion, where does it all cross?
Okay, this is John?
Jack.
Jack. Okay, Jack, that's a great question. And let me just encourage you on that gene splicing concept. Remember, that's the hardware of your DNA. It's different than when we're talking about now is epigenetics, which is not the gene itself. It's what it's causing the gene to do. So it's the idea that, like I said earlier, it's the gene that you're describing is the hardware. And what I'm talking about with epigenetics is the software, ways that our environment can change. So the concept of the mark of the beast being part of the genome is fairly unlikely, because that gene getting spliced into us really isn't going to do anything. It's most likely it will be turned off because your genome knows what belongs and what doesn't. So I wouldn't worry about that so much as your response to the mark of the beast in terms of, is there going to be the fear factor that's going to keep you from it? Is there a fear of God that's going to keep you from it? Or the fear of man? And often the fact that we're believers right now, and we're still around during that time, if that actually happens, we'll make a choice to not take it and let our consequences be in God's hands and not in the enemy's hands.
So, Lou, we just have a minute or so left, but just so with, say somebody that is struggling with addiction.
Yeah.
What do you say to them? And kind of from this perspective, like what would your encouragement be?
We have about 45 seconds.
My encouragement would be is just to look at your life, look at the environment you're in, and ask yourself, as a believer, how have I let the Word of God dwell in me? And let God's Word come in and practice meditating on it and see the power that it has by the power of the Holy Spirit. Give God access to your heart. That's the greatest thing I can give them right now.
That's a great way to, that's a great moment for the music to come on.
Yes, indeed. Dr. Lou Wing has been our guest. You can find his book on Amazon or on his website, which is lumenwing.org. Lumen is spelled Luman, lumenwing.org. And you can find the book there again. It's called Genes of Eden. This book is a good book about genes. Good. I was trying to make a reference to that commercial from a few months ago, but anyway, didn't work out. Should have thought of it. But anyway, Genes of Eden, pick it up at lumenwing.org. And Dr. Wing, great to see you here in the studio again today. Pastor Brian Broderson, good to see you as always.
Yes.
We'll do it again next week, yeah?
Do it, yep.
Okay. God bless you guys. We'll see you at church on Sunday, and we'll be back here on Pastor's Perspective on Monday.